Picture this. Kids riding bikes without helmets, cars cruising with no seatbelts, and parents waving from porches without a hint of worry. In the 1950s, this wasn't rebellion. It was just life. The air itself seemed lighter, not yet crowded with rules, regulations, or fear. Life felt unguarded, unmeasured, and in many ways, freer than it has ever been since. Small-town America thrived on trust. Neighbors didn't just live next door. They knew one another by name, swapped pies over fences, and left doors unlocked without thinking twice. A knock on the screen door was never a cause for alarm, but a welcome surprise. Children darted across lawns and streets, chasing baseballs or fireflies until dusk, with parents confident the community would keep an eye on them. That sense of safety wasn't built on technology or constant supervision. It was built on human connection. Families moved through daily routines with ease. A trip to the corner store was more than an errand. It was a moment of belonging. The grocer might slip an apple into a child's hand. The barber might pause for a laugh before trimming another head. And the postman was as much a part of the family as the cousins who lived down the road. Without layers of rules dictating every detail of life, people leaned on each other in quiet, steady ways. The absence of strict safety laws wasn't seen as neglect. It was seen as ordinary. Kids tumbled from bikes, scraped knees, and hopped back on without a thought. Families piled into the car. Children stretched out in the back seat. And no one gave a second thought to seatbelts that weren't even installed yet. Today, it might seem shocking, but then it was part of the fabric of everyday living. Freedom wasn't just a word people used. It was something they lived in the smallest details. Government oversight was lighter too. Families built backyard treehouses without permits, burned leaves in the fall without restrictions, and trusted that common sense was enough to guide them. There were fewer forms to fill, fewer rules to memorize, fewer voices telling people what not to do. That lack of interference gave daily life a rhythm of simplicity, where people felt they carried more responsibility for themselves and their communities. The heart of it all was optimism. The war was over, the economy was booming, and America seemed to stand at the edge of possibility. People bought their first homes, gathered for neighborhood picnics, and sent their kids to schools that promised a better future. There was a belief almost unshakable that life was moving forward in the right direction. The ordinary wildness of the 1950s wasn't loud or rebellious. It was quiet, woven into how people trusted, played, and dreamed. But as the years rolled forward, the rules began to multiply and what once felt normal started to look reckless. Imagine sparking a cigarette in a hospital waiting room or during a cross-country flight and nobody blinking an eye. In the 1950s, smoking wasn't just common. It was woven into nearly every part of American life. To smoke was to belong, to look sophisticated, even to look healthy. The habit carried none of the stigma we attach to it today. Cigarettes filled every corner of public space. Hospital rooms had ashtrays by the bed. Teachers smoked in the lounge between classes. Airplanes offered complimentary packs with your seat. In restaurants, smoke drifted above booths like a second ceiling, and few complained. The idea that smoke could be dangerous wasn't the cultural conversation, it was invisible. To light up was to participate in the rhythm of society. Even doctors, the very people we trust to protect health, were among its strongest promoters. Advertisements featured physicians in crisp white coats holding a cigarette and smiling with approval. Some campaigns even suggested certain brands were better for your throat or easier on your lungs. Trust and authority made these endorsements powerful. If your doctor smoked and told you it was fine, how could it possibly be dangerous? Warning labels, health studies, anti-smoking campaigns, none of these existed in everyday awareness. Cigarette packs carried no bold print reminders, no images of blackened lungs. Smoking was marketed as glamorous, not harmful. The lack of education left people free to indulge without guilt. unaware of the risks that would later dominate public debate. For many, smoking wasn't only a habit, it was a symbol. It marked the passage from youth into adulthood. Teenagers slipping behind a barn with stolen packs felt daring, while adults lit up after work to signal their maturity. In movies, a hero's first puff could define his character. For women, it often meant sophistication and allure. Cigarettes became shorthand for confidence, rebellion, and success. At the heart of it, smoking was social. Coworkers bonded over cigarette breaks. Dinner parties ended with friends gathered in the living room, smoke curling through lamplight. A pack was shared as a gesture of goodwill, just as coffee or dessert might be offered. To decline was unusual. To participate was natural. This unspoken code turned tobacco into more than a product. It became a kind of cultural glue. Looking back, it can be difficult to imagine how normalized it all was. Today, the sight of smoke in an airplane or hospital would spark outrage. But in the 1950s, it was simply part of the air people breathed, as ordinary as the ringing of a telephone or the clinking of glasses. It was a habit so widespread that the idea of banning it seemed unthinkable. But smoking wasn't the only everyday habit that feels wild by today's standards. Families piled into cars, kids bouncing in the back seat, windows rolled down and not a single seatbelt in sight. That was the American road in the 1950s, a decade when safety was hardly part of the conversation. Cars were built for comfort and power, not protection, and families embraced the freedom of the open road without worrying about what might happen if things went wrong. Seatbelts existed, but almost no one used them. Most cars didn't even come with them installed, and the thought of buckling in felt unnecessary, even strange. Wide bench seats stretched across the front, letting 3 people slide in side by side. Children climbed over the seats, napped across laps, or stood on the floor to get a better view out the window. Parents might have scolded them to sit still, but rarely for safety reasons, more for peace and quiet on a long drive. Car design celebrated size and speed. Detroit automakers sold bigger, shinier vehicles with massive tail fins and roaring engines. The appeal was status and style. Safety features? Those were barely a footnote. The heavier frame was seen as enough to protect a family, and the idea of crash testing was still years away from shaping design. To many drivers, the thrill of horsepower mattered more than any invisible risk. Accidents, of course, happened often, but they were viewed as part of the risk of driving, not something that could be engineered away. Communities mourned lives lost on highways, but did not demand sweeping changes. People accepted the danger as the price of progress. The car symbolized freedom too powerfully to be weighed down by worries about restraint or regulation. That sense of freedom behind the wheel was central to the culture. Families planned road trips across state lines. Teenagers cruised downtown on Saturday nights, and the car became more than transportation. It was identity, independence, and adventure. The wide-open road symbolized everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves: bold, limitless, and unrestrained. Government intervention was still a distant thought. Safety commissions and consumer advocacy had yet to challenge automakers, and no national regulations forced companies to rethink their designs. It wasn't until the 1960s and beyond that seatbelts began appearing widely, pushed by studies and laws. In the 1950s, though, the car was a place of freedom, not rules. The road was fast, the cars were heavy, and people believed that was enough. Looking back, it's almost hard to believe. Today, the idea of letting children roam loose in a moving car is unthinkable. But in the 1950s, it was simply part of the journey. What mattered most was that feeling of motion windows down, hair flying, radio humming, the horizon wide open ahead. And if riding without seatbelts seems wild, wait until you hear about the freedoms behind the wheel. In some towns, it wasn't too unusual for a driver to sip a cold beer while cruising Main Street, and nobody stopped them. In the 1950s, the sight didn't spark panic or outrage. It was casual, often unnoticed, and in many communities, entirely normal. Cars weren't just a way to get somewhere, they were part of leisure, and alcohol slipped easily into that culture. There were no nationwide open container laws, no flashing billboards warning of the dangers, and little effort to connect drinking and driving as a national crisis. A driver might grab a six-pack on the way home from work, crack one open for the ride, and think nothing of it. Passengers joined in too, laughing, music spilling out of the rolled-down windows. To the people of that era, it wasn't a crime in progress. It was part of life. Police, in many places, looked the other way unless someone was clearly endangering others. A driver weaving badly might be pulled over, but even then, the outcome was often lenient. A stern warning or a ride home might have been the only consequence. Law enforcement itself reflected the times, lighter on regulation, heavier on community judgment. Unless tragedy struck, most towns didn't see drinking on the road as a pressing issue. Alcohol itself carried a different cultural weight. It was a symbol of adulthood, a marker of relaxation after a long day, and a fixture of celebration. From backyard barbecues to drive-in theaters, beer bottles and cocktail glasses were just part of the scene. Sliding that culture into the driver's seat felt natural, not dangerous, to a society still learning the long-term costs of mixing alcohol with speed. The tragedies, of course, were happening. Families mourned accidents where alcohol played a role. But those stories didn't yet dominate headlines or inspire national movements. It took decades of advocacy, research, and painful statistics before America reshaped its attitude. In the 1950s, the link between drunk driving and loss wasn't part of the mainstream conversation. It was background noise, easy to ignore in an era where optimism often overshadowed risk. Looking back now, it seems almost shocking how relaxed the culture was. Today, open container laws, strict DUI checkpoints, and awareness campaigns leave little room for tolerance. The idea of sipping a beer while driving feels reckless and impossible to imagine. But in the 1950s, it slipped into the rhythm of everyday life, a reflection of a time when personal freedom stretched farther than public caution. That era of open roads, relaxed enforcement, and casual indulgence feels almost unbelievable today. Yet it also reveals something larger about the culture. Freedom was prized so highly that even obvious risks were brushed aside. But it wasn't just cars and bars where freedoms ran wild. American kids grew up with few restrictions too. No phones, no tracking apps, just kids vanishing after breakfast, exploring until the streetlights came on. That was childhood in the 1950s, a kind of freedom that feels almost impossible to imagine now. Parents waved from the porch as children disappeared down the street, not worried about constant updates, not fearing the worst. The neighborhood itself felt like an extended family, and the unspoken rule was simple: be home when the lamps flickered on. Children roamed with little supervision, and that independence was part of growing up. They cut through fields, built forts in the woods, and spent entire afternoons knee-deep in creeks. Summers stretched endlessly, filled with scraped knees, muddy shoes, and adventures no adult kept track of. In those hours away from home, kids invented their own rules, created their own worlds, and learned to handle the small risks that came with freedom. Parents trusted that safety wasn't about constant monitoring, it was about community. Neighbors kept an eye out, older siblings took charge, and there was faith that people would step in if anything truly went wrong. That trust allowed parents to loosen their grip, confident that responsibility was shared among everyone. In many towns, the streets themselves were seen as safe places, not dangers to be avoided. Older siblings often became guardians in their own right. A 12-year-old leading a pack of younger children wasn't unusual. They decided where to go, when to come back, and how far to wander. Responsibility was passed down naturally, shaping kids into leaders long before adulthood called. For many, those lessons in independence stuck for life. The sense of freedom wasn't reckless, it was formative. Children learned to climb trees without supervision, to swim in rivers without lifeguards, to solve disputes without parents stepping in. These experiences built resilience, a kind of quiet strength that came from trial, error, and exploration. The small stumbles, the scary moments, even the times they got lost and had to find their way home all became part of growing up. Today, the contrast is stark. Modern parents hover, often labeled as helicopter guardians, monitoring every step with cell phones, schedules, and supervision. Childhood has shifted from roaming free to carefully planned activities, leaving little room for the kind of wandering that once defined it. Safety is tighter, but so is the leash. What was once ordinary freedom now feels almost radical. For those who remember, the memory is vivid. The rush of air on a bicycle ride across town, the sound of sneakers slapping against sidewalks, the taste of a peanut butter sandwich eaten on a friend's porch before heading back out for another round of adventure. It was a childhood without constant check-ins, one that depended on courage, curiosity, and trust. And while kids ran free outside, the schools inside looked nothing like they do today. A wooden paddle on the teacher's desk wasn't decoration, it was discipline, and it was perfectly legal. In the 1950s, corporal punishment wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Classrooms were places of order, and if a student stepped out of line, the consequences could be swift and physical. The sight of a paddle, ruler, or strap carried more weight than any lecture could. Parents largely supported this approach. Teachers were trusted as authority figures, second only to parents themselves. If a child came home with sore knuckles or red welts, it wasn't seen as abuse. It was seen as necessary correction. In fact, many parents reinforced the same discipline at home, creating a culture where fear and respect blended into a single lesson. Authority was not to be questioned. Harsh discipline was normalized. Talking back, arriving late, or even failing to pay attention could result in physical punishment. Detentions and suspensions existed, but the immediate sting of a ruler on the hand was far more common. Students knew the boundaries, and stepping over them often meant a public example made in front of their peers. For many, the classroom carried an undercurrent of tension, a reminder that learning came with the risk of punishment. Respect in schools was often built on fear. Teachers rarely had to raise their voices. The simple threat of discipline was enough to keep order. Students sat straighter, spoke less, and understood that rules were not negotiable. This environment created a sharp divide between adults and children, one that left little room for questioning or individuality. Children's rights were not part of the national conversation. The idea that a student might challenge a teacher's authority or that parents might sue a school for punishment would have seemed unthinkable. Discipline was seen as a foundation of education, as natural as chalk on the blackboard. The focus was on shaping obedience, not protecting individuality. Looking back, the contrast with today's classrooms is striking. Modern schools operate under strict legal protections, where even verbal reprimands are scrutinized. Corporal punishment is banned in most places, and the idea of hitting a student is met with outrage. Today's debates focus on mental health, inclusivity, and nurturing environments, concepts far removed from the firm hand of the mid-20th century. For some, the old ways built discipline and respect. For others, they left lasting marks, memories of humiliation, fear, and silence in rooms meant for learning. Either way, the paddle on the desk stands as a reminder of how different the classroom once was, a reflection of a society that valued authority above comfort. And outside of the classroom, another freedom seems almost unthinkable now. Teenagers at the bar. High schoolers could walk into a bar, order a drink, and no one would ask for ID. In the 1950s, that scene wasn't rare. It was part of the social fabric in many towns across America. Rules around alcohol were looser, and in some states, there were no age restrictions at all. The idea of carding every customer simply hadn't taken hold. If you looked old enough, you were old enough. Many states set the drinking age at 18, but others allowed beer and wine purchases at even younger ages. And in practice, those laws were often ignored. Bartenders and store clerks weren't trained to question every teenager, and community culture leaned toward acceptance. A high school senior with a date could order a beer without suspicion, and friends might spend Friday nights in places where adults gathered. This access blurred the line between youth and adulthood. Teenagers often shared spaces with grown men and women, adopting adult habits before they had fully grown into them. Bars and dance halls became proving grounds, where young people tested their independence and carried themselves with the confidence of maturity. To be seen with a drink in hand was not just casual, it was a rite of passage. Alcohol carried a symbolism that went beyond taste. It marked the transition into a wider world, a quiet nod that one belonged in adult company. For boys, it was a show of toughness. For girls, a gesture of sophistication. Movies, music, and advertising reinforced these ideas, painting alcohol as glamorous, exciting, and entirely normal. The idea that teenagers needed protection from it was not part of the conversation. Little concern was given to the dangers of underage drinking. The health risks, the accidents, the impaired judgment, these weren't yet national debates. Communities treated alcohol as part of life, and responsibility for handling it fell squarely on the individual. Parents might have disapproved of excess, but they rarely imagined that their teenager grabbing a beer was a cause for alarm. That cultural looseness began to change in the decades that followed. Stories of drunk driving accidents, public health campaigns, and shifts in law reshaped America's view. By the 1980s, the legal drinking age rose to 21 nationwide, and enforcement grew strict. What was once casual became heavily regulated, and the idea of high school students openly drinking in public faded into history. Looking back, it feels startling to imagine. Teenagers, barely out of childhood, sitting at bars alongside adults, sipping the same drinks, and blending into the same crowd. It's a scene that today would cause outrage, but in the 1950s, it was just another Friday night. But alcohol wasn't the only part of life with wide-open rules. The skies themselves were wilder, too. Picture a flight where you could smoke, drink, and stretch out without airport security stopping you. That was air travel in the 1950s, a time when flying wasn't a hassle, it was an event. Boarding a plane felt closer to stepping into a cocktail lounge than passing through a security checkpoint. It carried a sense of glamour that made every passenger feel like a movie star. There was no say-ah, no long lines, no body scanners. Travelers strolled into airports with little more than a ticket and a suitcase. Friends and family could walk all the way to the gate to say goodbye. The process was simple, and the trust in passengers was high. The idea of removing shoes, emptying pockets, or being searched at every turn was decades away. Once on board, the indulgence continued. Smoking was not only permitted, it was expected. Ashtrays were tucked into every armrest, and cigarette smoke drifted lazily through the cabin. Passengers lit up after takeoff, drinks in hand, while stewardesses always dressed in crisp, stylish uniforms moved gracefully down the aisle with trays of cocktails. A flight wasn't just about getting somewhere. It was part of the experience. Drinking was common, too, and it carried the same sense of luxury. Champagne, whiskey, and martinis flowed freely, often included in the ticket price. Passengers leaned back in wide seats, sipping cocktails above the clouds, as if the sky itself had become a social club. For many, flying was as much about being seen as it was about traveling. Families treated flights like special occasions. Parents dressed their children in neat clothes, and adults wore suits, ties, or elegant dresses. The act of flying required presentation. It was costly, prestigious, and rare. Stepping onto a plane meant you were part of something glamorous, a world reserved for those who could afford it. The experience came at a price, of course. Air travel was expensive, out of reach for most working families. But those who could afford it carried home stories of champagne glasses, smooth service, and the thrill of crossing the country in hours rather than days. It felt like magic, and it set the stage for flying to become a symbol of progress. Comparing that era to today is startling. Now, air travel is routine, affordable, and heavily regulated. Security lines, cramped seats, and strict rules define the experience. Smoking is banned. Alcohol comes in tiny bottles at a steep price, and few people dress up for the journey. Flying has shifted from glamorous adventure to practical necessity. Still, for those who remember, the memory lingers. The hum of the engines, the glow of cigarettes, the clink of glasses, and the feeling that being in the air was something extraordinary. And yet, even as the skies felt free, nothing compared to the sense of freedom back home. The 1950s weren't lawless, they were trusting. A time when freedom was ordinary and rules were fewer. The era carried with it a sense of ease. When children roamed unsupervised, families drove with the windows down and no seatbelts, and teenagers tested adulthood earlier than the law now allows. Looking back, it seems wild. But at the time, it was simply life. What defined that decade was trust. Neighbors left doors unlocked and believed the community would protect them. Parents trusted the world enough to let their kids explore from dawn until dusk. Even businesses operated on faith, with credit often extended on a handshake. That collective trust built an atmosphere where people felt safe, not because of laws and locks, but because they belonged to one another. The risks were real, of course. Car accidents claimed lives, smoking filled lungs, and drinking blurred lines of responsibility. Yet in the balance of danger and optimism, the optimism often won. Families gathered at church picnics, kids played baseball in empty lots, and communities thrived on shared rituals. The hardships of the Depression and the war years were fresh in memory, and people wanted to believe in the promise of something better. Freedom was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. That is why nostalgia for the 1950s remains so strong. It is less about the details of cigarettes in airplanes or kids riding bikes without helmets, and more about the feeling of life without constant oversight. It is the memory of breathing a little easier, of trusting neighbors, of believing the world was open and safe enough to wander. For many, those images of simpler days carry warmth, even if history has revealed their hidden risks. The cultural shift towards safety and restriction reshaped daily life in the decades that followed. Laws multiplied, regulations tightened, and behaviors once taken for granted became unthinkable. Some of these changes saved lives and improved health. Others stripped away the informal trust that once tied communities together. The result is a world that feels safer in numbers, but often lonelier in spirit. Freedom today looks different. It is not the same as leaving your door unlocked or handing your child a bicycle without a helmet. But the memories of those earlier freedoms still matter. They remind us of what it meant to live with less control, more trust, and the sense that community itself was enough to keep you safe. The 1950s stand as a portrait of America at a crossroads, reckless at times, innocent at others, but always defined by a belief that the world was wide open. Which of these wild 50s freedoms would you bring back? Tell us in the comments.